Welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. Today we're going to focus our attention on grants, funding and incentive packages, and there's quite a lot of activity in this space at the moment and plenty of opportunities that are going to present themselves for small businesses over the next 12 months or so. So today we're joined by Peter Masterson. Peter's from AusIndustry. So welcome, Peter. Right, I'll just unmute you, sorry.
We'll get unmuted. Okay, there. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah.
And also Garry Pinch, who's head of our business advisory division, and certainly spends a lot of time with businesses out at the innovation campus and is heavily involved in the funding and incentive side of things. So welcome again, Garry.
Thanks, Mark.
So I guess, Peter, we might start with you. Are you able to give us a little bit of a background as to, I guess, your role and as well as the role that AusIndustry plays?
Yeah, sure. AusIndustry, like the side says, it's a federal government agency, and it's within the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resource. So, you know, we're part of the federal government's initiatives to assist business. And look, AusIndustry typically is what we call an outreach network that assists businesses in looking for grant opportunities, supporting them through growth, employment growth. So very much an outward-facing role. We deal with all sizes and all different types of businesses, on a weekly basis. Myself, I'm what's known as part of a national outreach network. There's probably about 20 of jobs similar to mine around Australia in regional locations. My region covers, from Helensburgh in the north to the Victorian border in the south and the Southern Highlands.
Cool. So I guess sort of in response to both COVID and the recovery strategy, the federal government's I guess their strategy seemed to be focused around a small business-led recovery. Is that what you're experiencing, Garry, or is that how you see it?
Yeah, certainly the federal government sort of had a large number of initiatives focused around, assisting small business. One, firstly, to survive through the COVID lockdown periods, then the recovery phase, which is probably where we're entering into now. And it's not surprising that the federal government's focused their attention regarding small business, when effectively small business employ about half the workers in Australia. But importantly, one of the stats that often goes unmissed is that small business employs about 4 out of 5 new jobs, or creates 4 out of 5 new jobs. And certainly often on the back of larger projects, which might be funded by government or funded by larger enterprises. But the real work that's done in regard to job creations, in regard to is done by small business, and it's looking at the statistics, simply for a lot of small businesses, if you've got 4 employees and you increase that by 1, you've actually increased your workforce by 20%. You think about those statistics in regard to, say, Qantas, where they effectively moved on about 6,000 people out of a workforce of 30,000, which basically meant they reduced their workforce by 20%. That sounded like a really big number. It is a big number. But often when you talk about small business, you talk about them increasing or decreasing their workforce by 1 out of 5. That's also a 20% number. And the economy with something like 2.5 million small to medium-sized enterprises really relies upon small business to do a lot of the heavy lifting in regard to job creation. So the government's focus in regard to the recovery now is, one, maintaining existing jobs and trying to build more. So it's clearly in the government's interest to focus on how do they incentivise small business. And what's quite evident in regard to the Treasury statistics that have been done, that if government puts money into small business, they spend it and they utilise it, which then flows into the economy straight away in regard to job creation. So you can see it's an effective strategy, and you can see that filtering through all the things that have been done by, announced in the federal government, and all the things done by federal government even before the budget.
Yeah. So we might turn our attention to some of the specifics of the programs that are available, Peter, and we might start with the modern manufacturing strategy.
Yeah, manufacturing has really had, for want of a better word, a renaissance that was driven out of need from COVID, when you saw some, global supply chains faltering or collapsing. And you saw a lot of our manufacturers, and look, a lot of people, manufacturing's had this tagline that it's been dying over the last few years. If anything, that's not the case. Manufacturing, I think, has been recalibrating and repositioning, and we saw a lot of great stories around how manufacturers pivoted to jump into gaps left by that global supply chain, and how they did it so nimbly and so efficiently. So there was lots of good stories there. So, coming out of this and looking at how the government can assist manufacturing, came out of this 1.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy. And there's some elements in it that are quite large, and they're for the large end of town. Got the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, which will be larger grants on more transformative projects. But then we go into some of the smaller programs that can assist local SMEs around, things like the Modern Manufacturing Fund, which we've already had one round of, and we're going to have another round coming opening up for applications very, very soon. In my region, we had 4 successful applications for the first round, and we'd be hoping to get more successful applications in the next round. I think that might be on the next slide, Mark. I've jumped one ahead. Yeah. So a lot of the manufacturing strategies, it focuses on those key areas that are there. So space, defence, recycling, clean energy, medical products, food and beverages, and resource technology and critical minerals processing. So the government is putting a lens through some of these things where they want to direct the activity. And Garry made a very good point early. You might not be in one of those industry sectors, but there's no reason why you can't pick up work from one of those industry sectors working in it. One of the times when I was sort of in of all places, a workshop that was dealing with, panel beating and doing some very high-end work on vintage Porsche cars. And I walked past this bench, and there was a whole stack of parts on this bench. And I said, they don't look like they're car parts. And they said, yeah, no, they're not. We're doing a job for defence, and that's a particular component that goes into a type of rifle that was there. And so it's funny how you can, even though you might not be in one of those individual sectors, if you keep your ear out and use your contacts and use your networks to look for opportunities to work within those sectors. So, a good point. So maybe if we could perhaps move on. Yeah. So Modern Manufacturing Initiative is again, there'll be more coming out about that in the new year, and it'll be very large scale. So it'll be around transformative projects, so if you think about things that are in discussion in the media, it might be around, hydrogen as energy sources, and there's a lot of things happening around Port Kembla with hydrogen hubs and talks like that. So they're the types of things that'll be open. So very much for the big end of town, going to hope, and, I wouldn't see any action around that, probably until March or April next year. Similarly with those the Manufacturing Translation Fund and Integration Funds. So very much the government's still in a design phase about what it's doing. So maybe if we move on to the...
so Peter, just in regard to that sort of, the hydrogen hub, for instance, that opens up opportunities for a whole range of other different services, just like architects, facilities of different types of services that might be provided to that hydrogen hub. And that's probably the thing that where, a lot of the small businesses regionally will get the benefit and flow out. And people would say, well, how do I get to know about these things? Yeah. And it's often connecting with the individuals who might be heading up those organisations. And LinkedIn's a really good tool for that.
LinkedIn is a really good tool. Again, I would advise people to jump onto the University of Wollongong's webpage and sign up to their newsletters. The university does a lot of good work in collaboration with industry. and usually has a finger in the pie of most large projects that are happening around here regionally, and that's another good entree into it, you know. And if you've got a particular speciality, make sure people know about it. So again, the slide, Manufacturing Modernisation Fund is the one that sort of excites me locally, because we've had some success here with 4 projects being funded in our region, and you know, we're expecting another round of this to open up. And what this is about capital, the Commonwealth assisting you with capital investment in your business. So it's about upskilling. It's about upskilling your business in terms of technology. Okay, so if you were looking to replace an old worn-out air compressor system with a new worn-out air compressor system, this is not for you. But if you were looking to bringing into into your business, into your manufacturing business, something to bring in automation, machine learning, something around robotics, something about a new business system, this is the one for you. It's about technology upgrades that'll help transform businesses. So ones that got funded around here last time was you know, automated packaging lines, automated bottling lines, automated welding and fabrication lines. You know, so a lot of things around robotics, automation, and also use of data, you know, more effective use of data. So
I guess, Garry, you know, with your time at the Innovation Campus, that capital investment is one of the key challenges for a number of businesses looking to scale.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And you know, looking at the modernisation, the Manufacturing Modernisation Fund as being a source of that funding, but keep in mind also, once you often a lot of these projects are based on co-funding, and you know, there's a range of co-funding alternatives, both offered at the innovation space, you know, in the innovation space, also through state governments, through private investment. So a lot of the ways that, you know, these sort of grant funding could well be one source of, you know, 2 or 3 different sources of funding. Plus, on top of that, particularly for small to medium-sized enterprises, the tax incentives, which we'll talk a bit further about, which effectively add another source of funding as an alternative.
Yeah, and I guess you know, that there seems to be a heavy focus on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM. I know that certainly in primary schools, STEM is, I guess, part of the curriculum now, and then the government sort of factored those sort of areas again into their funding mechanisms.
Absolutely, it's been in the news probably fairly consistently for the last few years, and particularly around you know, the number of high school students that are not taking maths in senior years. It was certainly had a fairly rigorous debate in my household. My eldest daughter is a high school English teacher, and my wife is a primary school educator that specialises in advanced maths. So you can see the debate that's happening around our table. But it has been there for a while, and it will continue into the future, particularly around engaging more women in STEM careers, in entrepreneurship. Lots of places that I visit, businesses that I visit, where maybe 10, 15 years ago, you would have never have seen a female in the workshop. You're seeing a lot more female apprentices, female technicians and things like that. And I think the great part about it's coming out of it is everyone's saying that how good a change it is to the culture of the workplace in those places. So certainly the government is extending that with you know, projects. There is granting opportunities open around now for people that want to do projects about increasing female participation in STEM, and also female participation in entrepreneurship. Okay, so they're currently there. A big one has been our Boosting Female Founders project. That has round 1 grants have not been announced yet, but they are not very far away. There will be another round of Boosting Female Founders that'll be opening probably in February next year. So anyone that's a female founder that's looking to get some good funding for their business needs to have a close look at that. Probably if you locally have a chat to me about your project. Things that have also come out of I guess out of the bushfire crisis and also out of COVID has been around, that upskilling business owners around their digital business skills. And I don't know if you guys see much of that in terms of the work you do with your clients. Yeah.
Yeah, we certainly do. And even for us in our own business, we were fortunate enough to be in a position where we had a fairly robust digital business plan that meant when everyone left the office, we could continue to operate relatively normally. But certainly, it highlighted a few weaknesses in businesses with that shift to working from home.
Yeah. Currently, the Southern Region BEC, even though they're located at Queanbeyan, they have people that operate in the Illawarra and South Coast, and they deliver one of our programs that's called the Australian Small Business Advisory Services. So there's a digital solutions program that's currently in existence. So anyone that needs to jump onto the Southern Region BEC website can find that. There's also going to be an extension of that program of 20 million to run a better national uptake to get that digital changes happening. And also a digital readiness assessment tool and a digital directors training package, which the department's currently designing now. We're sort of having a chat about that yesterday. So lots happening in that digital space as well.
Yeah, and there's also some initiatives around mental health and employees more generally. Mental health's been quite certainly quite a lot of media attention in relation to the mental health side of things, particularly in relation to COVID.
Yeah, certainly it has been something that the government has been aware of and has consulted widely. So there's more funding going into the good work that Beyond Blue do through the new Access for Small Business Service and some partnering that we're doing with Kate Carnell's Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. So they're great resources for businesses that are tapping into. Don't sit there and think you can handle it on yourself. Reach out. Some of these services are just absolutely fantastic. And the sort of region I'm dealing with, not so much in the Illawarra, but building upon the terrible experiences people had during bushfire. There's been a real need for these services, so make sure you use them if you need to.
Yeah, and then flowing on from that is the recently announced measure in the budget around the job maker hiring credit, which is coming online shortly.
Yeah. Keep an eye out for that. And I think Garry and I had a conversation many years ago that I was remembering, and I think we said that if every small business in the Illawarra put on 2 people, we'd wipe out unemployment in the Illawarra. I think it was something like that, Garry. Yeah. So certainly, certainly, if you're going to be employing people, make sure you take advantage of this. If you're in that space where you're not sure and you're looking for some assistance to get some, people in your business, use this job maker hiring credit. There'll be more coming about that as how to access it, but there's also some great assistance in the next 12 months for apprentices and training as well. So, make sure you jump onto those programs and make sure you factor them in.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, about how we might tie all these things in together. So job maker is, a key component of that. I guess now shifting our focus to the state level, there are a number of measures from the state government in relation to businesses that are already in play, and we're probably, with the state budget being handed down next week, expecting some more assistance to come as a result of that budget.
Yeah, look, I'm quite happy to talk on state government programs. We partner with them when we're working together to assist businesses. So I can't touch on what might or might not be in the budget next week, but certainly these things that we're going to run through now are around now. They've been around for a while. So there's lots of programs and options around energy saving in New South Wales. And, as the slide says, the energy saving schemes, it's been around for a while. And if you haven't been able to take advantage of it, now's a good time. So Just Google energysaver.newsouthwales.gov.au or the energy saving schemes, and you'll get put in contact with someone that can assist. And the low hanging fruit is always lighting. So if someone hasn't been through your business and replaced all your lighting with LEDs, you need to get that, because that's just an instant saving. But there's a whole range of other assistance they can give you. They can give you some analysis work about trying to decide what's the best way for you to save money with energy, and then direct you how to do that. So great program for the New South Wales government. Yeah.
We certainly had the guys come through and change over all our lighting in the office. Makes a tremendous difference, not only to the energy bill, but also to the quality of the light as well. So
yeah.
We've certainly we've sort of accessed that one ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Safe work.
Absolutely, very important. Safe Work New South Wales offer you a $500 rebate to install equipment to make your workplace safer. Sometimes that can be PPE. Sometimes it can be things around lifting, handling, so it can be trolleys, those sorts of things to relieve people from manual handling. All you've got to do is attend one of their online events, purchase your equipment within 12 months and seek a rebate. It's a great program, and it's a great way for them to engage with business as well. So
yeah.
So again, Peter, for a lot of small business, that's really it's basically a way to get $500 to fund any safety equipment, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Pretty well that simple.
Yeah, and the events used to be face to face, but now they're largely online because of COVID, and they're easy to attend. You don't have to leave your office, and you'll get some good value out of it.
Yeah, and I guess with those transitioning to a environment where we're learning to live with COVID, there'd be any number of opportunities to spend that money on measures to make the workplace safer for both employees and customers, I guess. So
absolutely, yep.
Yeah.
Minimum viable product grants has they've come and they've gone. They're in hibernation for a little while, but they've come back. Now, these grants are for what we call a pre-revenue startup. So someone that's working on a technology startup usually. And what they are is it's $25,000 in match funding. So up to $25,000, for every dollar the government gives you, you've got to have $1 as well. You have to have an ABN and have your business registered in New South Wales. And you've got to have a basic prototype proof of concept. And then a business partnered off to be able to provide you some feedback. So this is a grant that is great for startups that are looking to get their product to the next level. They are relatively easy to apply for, and they have a very quick turnaround time in terms of being successful, whether you're successful or unsuccessful. So it's quite an effective program about getting some impact and some dollars into our startups.
And I guess the key with the state government grants, it's all designed to attract and retain businesses in New South Wales. So you'll see that there's a strong requirement to be obviously be based in New South Wales.
That's right. If you're looking into doing a development somewhere else, overseas, perhaps because it's cheaper, this one's not for you. Your development cost must have to happen in New South Wales. Yeah.
So Peter, just with the MVP grant, so my understanding is that you can also have a spin out of, if an organisation is looking to develop a concept product as a new idea, they're able to set up an organisation that effectively that's independent from the main organisation, but potentially still be able to get this MVP grant.
Yeah, that's right. Quite often, businesses will create a spin-out company that's not related, in order to do some sort of new innovation or new development. Yeah.
Yep.
And there's also assistance for exporters.
Yeah, lots of assistance for exporters around at present. This is one that's coming from the New South Wales government, and it's designed to augment Commonwealth's Export Market Development Grant. So this is up to 50% of a maximum amount of 10,000, and it's really targeted towards marketing and business development overseas. So it's part of what they call the Going Global program, and it gives you entry into a network, and can grow to grow your business. So have a look at the website there. And locally, we have a great export advisor called Rory McAllister. It works with this program. So if you're interested in doing something out of that program for export, by all means, make sure you come back to myself or go back to Garry and Mark, and we'll connect you up with Rory McAllister, and we'll see what assistance we can bring to you with that program.
So I guess assistance can be provided in a number of ways. With the items that we've discussed earlier today are in relation to direct funding, whether it be through grants or rebates. But assistance is also provided through the taxation system, and a lot of these measures have been previously announced. But it's important to touch on them again because they do provide certainly cash flow benefits to business to assist either in the growth of the business or in some cases just surviving. So Garry, I might throw to you in this area. What are some of the small business incentives from a tax point of view that are sort of floating around at the moment?
Yeah, so certainly in regard to, most of these announcements were made as part of the federal budget, and some of them seem to be duplications of what might have previously been in place, but they're actually largely extensions. So for example, the temporary full expensing, for a lot of small businesses, they would have thought, well, we're able to fully expense up to $150,000. And so what does temporary full expensing? To a large degree, those provisions of the budget extended that full expensing to larger organisations. So up to like $500 million in turnover, as opposed to small business incentives, which might have been previously sort of limited to $10 million in turnover. But there's also extending of the instant asset write-off. Now, where these things tie into funding, and I'll talk a bit further about this in more detail, is that if there are tax concessions, it effectively allows the business to consider those tax savings as a source of funding added towards the other funding alternatives might be in place. So things like, as I said, the instant asset write-off, starting in the 2021 financial year, companies will be effectively be able to seek tax refunds in regard to offsetting losses they're incurring in the 2021 and 2022 financial years against prior year profits. So, and taking those profits or accessing tax that might have been paid on profits going back to the 2019 year. So if you've paid tax in regard to company profits in regard to the 2019 tax year, which you would have largely paid that tax towards the end of the 2020 year. And you've also got a tax bill in regard to your 2020 tax return, which is likely to be paid firstly in installments, potentially a final balance being payable in 2021. What this measure will allow you to do when you lodge your 2021 tax return, and if there are losses you've incurred, you'll be able to go back and offset that loss you've incurred in 2021 and also 2022 against the profits in the previous year to recover some of the tax you would have otherwise paid. Now, what the government's looking to do is to say, well, rather than money be in businesses' hands, which they can then utilise to employ or to maintain employment, than being sitting in government hands. So it's an incentive based around encouraging employment, but also growth of businesses going forward. The range of small business tax concessions also, that once again, it's the same concessions that are available to small businesses generally, but now it's been extended so that it's accessible to those businesses that have got $500 billion in turnover. So, previously those small business concessions were limited to businesses that had $10 million turnover. So things like stock write-offs, accelerated depreciation. And for those, for a lot of our, or a number of our clients that have got turnover in sort of that 11, 12, 15, 20, 30, $40 million, these concessions are going to provide significant savings in the current year. So that's something to keep in mind.
I think in in terms of percentage terms, it's something like 99% of businesses will be able to access those small business tax concessions. So, a huge number of businesses in the economy now.
Yep. And then also the previous announcements, the tax cuts, which were to come in on in the 2022 year, have now been brought back, or to start from the 1st of July 2020. We've talked a bit about this in the previous presentations, but once again, it's about putting more money into the economy by providing tax cuts earlier. And the final measure, just in regard to the change to the R&D incentives, where previously the R&D incentive was at 13.5% above the tax rate's now move up to 18.5% on the tax rate. It effectively means that the rebate's coming in at 46% for companies. So that's increasing the amount of money that's going into those businesses that are able to claim the R&D incentive. So those things were announced in the budget. There are also a number of other sort of incentives that were provided, which are a non-tax incentive. So firstly, in regard to the job make, which Peter talked briefly about, and effectively for employees, the businesses and new employees employed by businesses, and I'll say employees generally in the sense that there are some limitations in regard to the criteria in regard to those employees, but for employees between the ages of 16 and 29, there'll be a $200 per week subsidy. And then for those employees between 30 and 35, that's a $100 subsidy. We suspect that given that that scheme is going to be managed by the ATO, that most likely subsidies will be managed through the PAYG system. So, and then there's been announcements, obviously, JobKeeper 2. So the qualifying for JobKeeper 2.1 was done was finalised last week. So those businesses that are getting JobKeeper 2 will clearly be aware of that now. The amounts that have been reduced, but still significant. I won't go to that because we have talked about that at length also.
Just a quick thing, sorry, Gary, just on the JobKeeper 2 for people to be mindful of. If you didn't qualify for JobKeeper 2, that doesn't rule you out for JobKeeper 3, which commences in January. So whilst we know that there are a number of clients that have not necessarily qualified for JobKeeper 2, they may, going forward, qualify for the next round. So just keep an eye out for that.
Yep. And certainly in regard to those businesses, both whether they've qualified or not, it's worthwhile them having a clear understanding of what their turnover was in the December 2019 BAS, because that'll be the measuring period. So it's a good idea to have an idea as to what that BAS turnover amount is, because it will be based upon, as the basic criteria of qualifying, based on that December 19 BAS turnover amount. Apprenticeship subsidy. So once again, Peter sort of briefly touched on this, but effectively apprentices will receive a subsidy, or the employers of apprentices will receive a subsidy of 50% of their wages, subject to their qualified, meeting qualification apprenticeship requirements. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. And I'll talk a bit about that as to how that can be combined with some of the other subsidies in a few minutes. In the budget, there was also announced regarding changes in responsible lending laws, and largely based around encouraging businesses to borrow by making the lending process easier. There'd been a tightening up of some of the lending laws based around the Financial Services Royal Commission. Not saying those things were going to be watered down, but probably just put some of those things in context. And there have been directions made to the banks along those lines. The variety of business support grants, so where that's interesting measure is that, say, Victoria brought down a further $10,000 grant, and on the budget, in the budget, it was announced that those grants that state governments were putting out, subject to the state governments applying, could become tax-free. Previously, some of those grants have been taxable. So in some ways, the state government gives the grant at, say, $10,000, and if they're taxable, then the federal government gets 30% of that, being $3,000. And the federal government really saying, we actually don't want that money, but we also want to make sure that we qualify the grant to make sure it's going to get the tax concession. Through the week, South Australia announced they were also providing a further $10,000 grant. I think it might have been announced yesterday. And I suspect that we might see something similar coming out of the New South Wales government. And that's not a promise, not even a high level of knowledge that might have been announced, but I suspect there will be some further grants or some assistance coming through. But it's up for the state governments to apply to the federal government for those grants to receive tax concessions. And we can't sort of provide guarantees until those grants are announced, and no doubt they'll be announced to confirm whether they are exempt from federal income tax. In regard to, there's been a number of packages in regard to supporting jobs in residential construction. Part of that's obviously the apprenticeship subsidies, but also the encouragement in the construction industry generally, including the next item, which, around the first home loan deposit scheme, which, Engineer Jarvis talked about at a presentation 2 weeks ago. So there's certainly a number of measures in place. One of the things that was announced in the budget is a real focus on transport, and we've got a number of clients in that transport sector, building roads, etc. So there's going to be a lot more infrastructure spending there. I think there was some announcements regarding the Picton Road yesterday. So that's an example of those sort of changes. And those things do have a flow-on effect into small business. And, I think that's where it's important for small business to be on, knowledge about those changes, because they do have a flow-on effect in the industry, and it's important to be in contact with the people who are getting those assistance packages. And as I mentioned, as we talked, I think 3 weeks ago now, with Ryan Bradbury, in regard to insolvency measures, there was changes in insolvency reforms, which effectively means that businesses that are finding themselves in financial trouble, where that might have previously meant that they might fold, there's an increasing encouragement to try to avoid those businesses folding, largely based around not only looking after the goodwill of small business owners, but also critically look after their employees, with a view, the government's taking the view that we'd rather see businesses continue to survive in a tough environment, and their jobs to be maintained. And if we can change the insolvency laws, which make that possible, for creditors and business owners to have a common sense conversation about how they can work through debt arrangements, then that's a more effective way to maintaining employees. So that's very much where those insolvency reforms are directed. And then finally, as Peter also had in his slide, just in regard to some of the changes in enhancing digital technologies, and a lot of those, that digital technologies scheme is very useful in businesses, particularly small businesses seeking out specialist advisors who can come into their business and look at the technology and the digitization of their business and make recommendations in regard to what assistance they might be able to get from a variety of different sources, potentially refer them to different people, but also potentially refer them to funding packages that might be available to assist them. So that's important to keep those all things in mind. So their extensive range, probably this budget will probably go down as one of the most significant budgets to assist small business going forward. And if you couple that with, the lowest interest rates in history, small business probably has the best environment, certainly in my working lifetime, to look for the opportunity to grow and to continue to employ and enhance their business as it moves forward. We're probably not going to get, there'll be further announcements come through both from the state and federal government, which probably will enhance some of these things are available. But it's actually looking at how you can utilise some of these things together, which might provide some real enhancement.
Yeah, and I guess that's the key point, Gary. There's lots of different programs available, and not all of those programs are going to fit all businesses. And I guess the challenge and the strategy play for small businesses is, how do I access the grant funding that is applicable to me, but how can I leverage off all the other funding that's out there in the economy to maximise the benefit to my business. And I guess we'll go through a little example of how you might tie all of that together.
Yeah, sure. So probably the first thing is just look at some of the tips that I'd recommend just in regard to how to maximise the benefits. Firstly, becoming aware, and my suggestion is if you've got some new projects and you want to work out how they might be able to be partly funded by either state or federal government. We certainly often recommend people have a discussion with Peter. We have a close relationship over an extended number of years now. And he's always a good sounding board as to what programs might fit, potentially even other people who are doing similar things, how you do some collaboration work, and certainly reaching out to Tony in regard to state government grants. Tony Dyer will be also useful. So connecting is really one of the first things I'd recommend people do, to look at what might be available. Certainly approaching us, we're reasonably knowledge in regard to what programs, but I often run things by Peter in regard to things that clients are looking to do. Certainly, once again, making sure you're signed up to AusIndustry and state government newsletters and contact lists. If you go onto the AusIndustry website, you can basically put your email details in and they'll keep you informed about what programs are going. And that's always a good starting point to identify those funding packages that you might get advantage from. One area that I've found a number of clients are using is that they keep an eye on who the potential grant recipients might be, particularly when they're focused around larger grants, where they might say, well, that doesn't apply to me because I'm not large enough to get that grant. But you might have some particular expertise, skills, services that are potentially provide some benefit to one of those grant recipients. So two things I would suggest that particularly small businesses do is keep an eye on the people that might potentially be grant recipients. Once the grants are announced, there's always a public announcement of who received the grant and how much they received. What I'd suggest is you reach out to those organisations, particularly where you feel you've got some skills, services or expertise. Now, people say, well, how to reach out? Reach out to someone like Peter, say, do you know someone in this organisation I might be able to talk to? Or is it a good place to start? Certainly reaching out through LinkedIn, being connected, as Peter mentioned before, with the university, and the university's got is heading up a program called SME Advantage. So if you reach out to Sarah, who runs that program, she's always a good contact point for maybe connecting small and medium-sized enterprises with the larger enterprises that receive those grants. So using those connections is really, really important for small business, and don't certainly exclude, take the view of excluding yourself potential, some of the accessing some of the grant funding in a collaboration sort of way. And probably the other side of it is what's important is that you be, and this has been said quite a number of times, but I've actually seen it in action quite often, is a lot of the people who get grant funding are fairly ready with projects. They just are waiting for opportunities as to how they might be funded. And often people say, well, how do they get their information together so quickly to get a grant application in? Largely because the grant applications are already ready to move. They potentially have been used in previous grant applications and then need to be altered simply just to meet the current grant application requirements. But I would say that 50% of the grants that I've seen that have been successful were actually already, the projects were actually already in the pipeline in some form or other. So the businesses were ready to go. Yeah.
One thing a government grant applications always ask, and this is something that you can have pre-prepared and ready to go, they want to know about you, they want to know about your business, they want to know about the people in your business. So they look for that capability and experience as a part of the program, and it's a very important part of how you sell yourself to someone that you've never ever seen before that's assessing your grant application. So rather than leave that to a situation where you're in a live round and it's, you know, you're trying to manage your business, you're trying to get this grant application done. You know, if you've got some quiet time, put some of those building blocks together that you will use over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, the key to that is how do you combine all the different incentive programs? And we might run through an example of that now, Gary.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'm just doing a quick exercise of saying whether you've got, say, $100,000 in grant funding. Yeah, that could be both from government, but also private enterprise. And then worked out that there's potentially, without doing a lot of work, that there's potentially $177,000 in benefits. You know, obviously 100,000 that's coming from the grant fund itself, but then you know, if you're spending $177,000, there's potentially something in the order of $10,000 in GST credits, assuming that you've got $100,000 in net GST expenditure. So that gives you an extra 10 grand. You've also got, if you take advantage of employing apprentices or using job maker credits, depending on the amount of wages to apprentices, but I've assumed that, say, the wages of apprentices was $60,000, then you're potentially entitled to a 50% subsidy of those. So that represents a $30,000. If you then look at if part of the expenditure was spent on asset replacement or some of the instant asset write-offs, and assume at this stage it's not R&D related, then the asset write-off itself could generate about $37,000 in tax savings. So there's your there's your $177,000 out of $100,000 in funding, just in regard to those sort of areas of saving. And then you combine that with, and if you looked at, if some of those costs were cost-related R&D funding, instead of potentially the $37,000 in income tax savings, the R&D incentives could generate about $46,000 in R&D tax rebates. So keep those things in mind, that certainly what's happening with organisations that are focused on raising grant funding or funding generally, look at the whole project and how it can be funded. So they might say, well, the project's going to cost $200,000. If I get $100,000 from a grant funding, the other $100,000 has to be co-funded. They might outlay initially. Good thing about interest rates being really low at the moment, there's not a lot of cost in the capital. But then once you've funded that $100,000, there's then potential to access these other benefits, which in this case, as an example, and it's not an extreme example at all, there's probably opportunities to increase the amount of those concessions to the extent it could even be the full funding of the extra $100,000, but just assuming that you already get $77,000. So largely out of that $200,000, if you've got $100,000 in grant funding, then largely the other $77,000 would be funded by governments in some form or other also. Now, you might say, well, that's seems a bit too good to be true, but this is part of those incentive programs the government's trying to encourage. They're actually trying to create the environment that encourages business to grow. So it's like they are providing opportunity. So for a $200,000 investment, it effectively costs the business about $23,000 in this instance. Yeah, replace that with the R&D incentive, then effectively it's only costing the business, you know, $10,000 or $15,000. So just keep those things in mind, and that the incentives are designed to encourage businesses to grow, to employ new people, and it may be that this is the ideal time to grow. Still keep in mind that it's not a lot of sense in grow if all you're going to do is do something in the very short term and then retract later on. It's about identifying those areas that will create sustainable growth. And certainly governments will be focused around any funding that they provide will be focused around something that's a sustainable growth area, not something that's going to be a 12-month project that doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. I mean, and I think it's the key takeaway there is, yeah, don't not to narrow your focus, have a quite a broad approach and a little bit of creative thinking about how you might get these projects off the ground, or how you might get access to a new market, or something like that. So thanks for that. Also, I'd like to thank Peter for your insight. We've been through a lot of detail today, and there's plenty of details in those slides. We will make the slides available for the attendees today. So if you would like a copy of the slides, if you just make contact with the office, and we can organise to get those emailed out to you. There'll also be a recording of the webinar, which will be up on our website and our other social media channels as well. So thanks again, Peter. Peter's contact details are there. Again, reach out to Peter if you've got an idea or you think something might have legs. Alternatively, to reach out to Garry or someone in our office as well.
I'd just like to highlight that business.gov.au website, Mark. Any state or local government grants, that is the single source of truth, business.gov.au. You jump on there, in their search field, if you just put subscribe, the field will come up, put your email address in there, hit subscribe. That will get you any announcements from government around funding. It'll also get you any announcement about decisions government have made about who's getting grants. So all that information that we talked about today will flow from that website. One thing that's popping up around a lot of government initiatives and a lot of government assistance, and this happens from time to time, we get people that set up their own business, they market themselves as experts in this area and charge you a $300 or $400 fee to really what you can get for free out of the government. So they're scams, be careful of them. They'll even ring you up, they'll target you on the phone. They'll promise you that you'll recoup their subscription fee out of the next successful grant that you get. They never happen. So just be really wary of scams. You should never have to pay for information about government programs. That is always free from the government, and we have good resources to help you.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of your role, Peter, is to make sure the money gets out there.
Absolutely. There's nothing better.
You're not in the business of not giving it away.
No, there's nothing better than when we have someone that's had a really good success story out of a grant. It's the best feeling ever, and it's why I do this job. So,
yep. So we've also got Tony Dyer from the Business Development Manager at the Department of Regional New South Wales. Tony, if it's more a state-based grant, Tony's probably the person to touch base with. But as Peter said, they tend to work hand in hand with each other.
Quite often, if you get Tony, you get me, or if you ask me, you get Tony as well. We'll go and do dual meetings, so you get both perspectives. Yep.
Yeah. So thanks again, Peter and Garry, for taking the time out of your day to join the webinar. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll have some businesses out there reaching out with some ideas and getting some access to some grant funding. So thanks again, guys. Just in relation to our webinar next week, so we're going to be joined by Tony Bates, who's the director at Blue Point Consulting, to look through investing and all things investments. It's been a challenging year for investors this year with COVID and a US election that some people would say has been resolved, and others wouldn't, and also sort of trade tensions with China. So Tony Bates will share his thoughts on what 2021 might look like, and some of the opportunities that might present themselves. So looking forward to that presentation next week with Tony. And again, thanks everyone for joining today, and we'll see you next week.